On the morning of March 12, 1981, Robert Hanley woke to the sound of his wife's pen scratching against paper in the kitchen. It was 5:47 a.m. The sound shouldn't have bothered him. Sarah had always been an early riser, often making notes for her graduate thesis on Eastern European literature before he left for work. But that morning, as pale light filtered through the curtains of their modest townhouse in Arlington, Virginia, something about the rhythm of that pen made his chest tighten. It was too deliberate, too careful, like someone transcribing rather than thinking. He lay still, listening. The pen stopped. A drawer opened, then closed. Water ran in the sink. Normal sounds. Sounds he'd heard every morning for 3 years of marriage. But now they felt different, and he couldn't explain why. He told himself it was the job getting to him. 14 months working counterintelligence at the Defense Intelligence Agency did that to a man. You started seeing patterns where there were none. Started suspecting everyone, even the people you loved. Robert dressed quietly and came downstairs. Sarah was at the table reading the Washington Post with her coffee, the picture of serene domesticity in her blue bathrobe. Her dark hair was pulled back. No makeup yet. She looked up and smiled, that same smile that had made him fall in love with her at a university reception 4 years ago, when he was finishing his military intelligence training and she was a doctoral candidate studying Soviet dissident poetry. "Morning," she said. "Coffee's ready. Thanks." He poured himself a cup, black, and sat across from her. The notebook she'd been writing in was closed now, tucked beside the fruit bowl. He could see the edge of its brown leather cover. She caught him looking. "Just making notes for my Akhmatova chapter," she said easily. The symbolism of silence in her war poems. It's fascinating how she could say so much by saying nothing. He nodded, took a sip of coffee. The symbolism of silence. That was Sarah's world, the world of Russian poetry and coded meanings, of words that meant one thing on the surface and another thing entirely underneath. He'd always found it beautiful, the way she could decode layers of meaning in a single stanza. Now that same skill made him uneasy in ways he couldn't articulate. "You okay?" she asked. "You look tired. Didn't sleep well. Bad dreams?" Something like that. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Her fingers were warm. Real. This was Sarah. His Sarah. The woman who brought him tea when he worked late. Who left notes in his briefcase saying she loved him. Who'd cried in his arms when her father died. The idea that she could be anything other than what she appeared was absurd. Paranoid. But paranoia was part of his job description now. At DIA, they'd trained him to notice the inconsistencies. The small changes in behavior that might indicate someone had been compromised. They'd shown him case files of Americans who'd been turned, who'd betrayed their country for money or ideology or love. The files always started the same way, small signs that were ignored until it was too late. Robert finished his coffee and kissed Sarah goodbye. She tasted like coffee and toothpaste. At the door, he turned back. She was already at the sink, washing the dishes, humming something softly. A Russian song, probably. She hummed them often. He'd never thought anything of it before. The drive to Bolling Air Force Base took 40 minutes in morning traffic. Robert used the time to push his unease aside, to remind himself that his job required him to be suspicious of Soviet agents and foreign intelligence operatives, not his own wife. Sarah had been vetted before they married. Standard procedure for anyone married to someone with his clearance level. She'd passed. Her background was clean. Born in Pennsylvania, parents both academics, no travel to the Soviet Union, no suspicious contacts. She studied Russian literature because she loved poetry, not because she was a spy. Still, as he pulled into the secure parking lot and showed his ID to the guard, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. That morning, with the pen scratching in the darkness, had opened a door in his mind that he couldn't quite close. Inside the building, past 3 security checkpoints, Robert entered the windowless office he shared with 2 other analysts. The walls were covered with maps of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, marked with pins indicating known intelligence activities. His desk was buried under classified reports about Soviet military movements, intercepted communications, suspected agent networks operating in the United States. This was his world now, a world of shadows and suspicions, where nothing was what it seemed. His colleague, Tom Matthews, was already there, sorting through overnight cable traffic from overseas stations. "Morning, Hanley. You look like hell. Feel like it too? Late night?" "Something like that." Tom handed him a stack of reports. These came in from Fort Meade. NSA intercepted some interesting chatter from the Soviet embassy. Might be related to that courier case we've been tracking. Robert took the reports and sat down. For the next several hours, he lost himself in the work, analyzing communication patterns, cross-referencing names with known KGB officers, building profiles of potential operatives. This was the real Cold War. Not the dramatic confrontations you saw in movies, but endless hours of paperwork and analysis trying to find needles in haystacks, trying to identify which of the thousands of Soviet nationals in the United States might be intelligence officers and which Americans they might have recruited. The statistics were sobering. The FBI estimated there were several hundred KGB and GRU officers operating under diplomatic cover in Washington alone. They recruited secretaries, clerks, military personnel, anyone with access to classified information. They were patient, professional. They built relationships over years, sometimes decades. They looked for vulnerabilities, financial problems, marital troubles, ideological sympathies, personal secrets. And they exploited them. By lunch, Robert had pushed the morning's unease to the back of his mind. He ate a sandwich at his desk while reviewing a file on a suspected illegal, a Soviet agent operating under false American identity. The illegal had been in place for 8 years before being discovered, living a completely ordinary life, working an ordinary job, while secretly photographing documents and passing them to handlers. 8 years. Right under everyone's noses. The afternoon brought a meeting with his supervisor, Colonel Bradley, a career military intelligence officer with 30 years of experience and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. "Hanley, we've got a new case I want you on," Bradley said, sliding a thin folder across his desk. "Low priority? Probably nothing, but it needs to be checked out. Department of State employee, mid-level analyst in the Soviet desk. Someone reported that he's been making photocopies of documents after hours. Could be he's just behind on his work. Could be something else." Robert opened the folder. The subject's name was George Brennan. Married, 2 kids. Clean record. But there was a photograph attached, taken by building security, Brennan at a copy machine at 9 p.m., when the office was mostly empty. "I'll look into it," Robert said. "Do that. And Hanley? Don't let this job make you crazy. I've seen it happen. Good men who start seeing ghosts everywhere. Remember, most people are exactly what they appear to be. The spies are the exception, not the rule." Robert nodded, but he thought about Sarah's notebook, about the sound of her pen in the darkness, about how she always seemed to know when he'd had a difficult day at work, even when he tried to hide it, about the way she asked him questions, gentle questions, about his job, his colleagues, the projects he was working on. Normal questions. The questions any spouse would ask. That evening he came home to the smell of cooking. Sarah had made his favorite meal, roast chicken with potatoes and green beans. She was in the kitchen, her hair down now, wearing jeans and a sweater, looking relaxed and happy. "How was your day?" she asked, kissing his cheek. "Long. Yours? Productive. I finally cracked the structure of that Akhmatova poem cycle. Want to hear about it?" Over dinner she talked about Russian poetry while he nodded and made appreciative sounds. He watched her hands as she gestured, explaining the intricate ways Akhmatova had encoded political messages in love poems during Stalin's purges. Sarah's passion for the subject was genuine. He could see it in her eyes, hear it in her voice. This wasn't an act. But later, after they'd cleaned the dishes and settled on the couch to watch the evening news, he noticed something. Sarah had her small notebook with her, the one she'd been writing in that morning. During the news broadcast, while the anchor reported on tensions between the U.S. and Soviet Union over intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Europe, Sarah made a small note, just a few words, then closed the notebook. "What did you write?" he asked, trying to sound casual. She looked surprised. "Oh, just a thought for my dissertation. Something about how modern political rhetoric echoes Stalinist propaganda techniques. It's probably nothing. Can I see?" For just a fraction of a second, something flickered across her face. Hesitation? Fear? Then it was gone, replaced by puzzlement. "Why?" "Just curious about what you're working on." She opened the notebook and showed him. The page was filled with neat handwriting, observations about poetry and symbolism. The note she'd just made read, "Rhetorical parallel, peace through strength. vs. peaceful coexistence, both masks for military buildup. Mirror propaganda? See?" "Academic rambling," she said, smiling. "Not very exciting." He smiled back and kissed her forehead. "I think it's exciting. I love that you think about these things." But after she went to bed, Robert stayed up late, sitting in the dark living room, thinking. There was probably nothing wrong. Sarah was a graduate student writing about Soviet poetry. Of course, she took notes. Of course, she was interested in political rhetoric. That was her field. Yet something nagged at him. The KGB's most successful recruitments often involved people with legitimate reasons to study Soviet culture. People who could travel, correspond with Soviet citizens, attend academic conferences. People whose interest appeared entirely innocent. He thought about the training he'd received, about the case studies they'd reviewed, about how the best covers were built on truth, not lies. He went upstairs quietly. Sarah was asleep, breathing softly. He stood in the doorway of their bedroom, watching her. She looked peaceful, vulnerable. He thought about waking her, confessing his suspicions, asking her directly if there was anything she needed to tell him. But what would he say? "I'm worried you might be a Soviet spy because you take notes." It was insane. Robert went back downstairs and poured himself a whiskey. He thought about Colonel Bradley's warning about seeing ghosts. Maybe that's all this was. The job poisoning his mind, making him suspicious of the person he loved most. He drank the whiskey and decided to forget about it. To trust his wife. To trust what he knew in his heart. But the next morning, Sarah was up early again, writing in that notebook again, and the sound of her pen in the darkness made his chest tight again. The pattern continued for weeks. Robert tried to ignore it, tried to focus on his work, but he found himself paying attention to small things he'd never noticed before. The way Sarah always asked about his day in specific detail. The way she remembered names of his colleagues, projects he'd mentioned in passing. The way she seemed particularly interested when he talked about Soviet intelligence activities. One evening in early April, he came home to find Sarah on the phone in the kitchen. She was speaking in Russian, her voice low and intense. When she saw him, she said goodbye quickly and hung up. "Who was that?" he asked. "Professor Dmitri from Georgetown. We were discussing my translation of a Mandelstam poem. I didn't know you were that close with him." "He's on my dissertation committee, Robert. We talk regularly." Professor Dmitriev, Robert knew the name. He was a Soviet émigré who defected in the 1960s, now a prominent scholar of Russian literature. Completely legitimate. But Robert made a mental note to check if Dmitriev had ever been flagged by counterintelligence. That weekend, Sarah attended an academic conference in New York. She'd mentioned it weeks ago. A symposium on Cold War literature at Columbia University. She would be gone for 2 days, presenting a paper on censorship and creative resistance in Soviet poetry. Robert helped her pack, kissed her goodbye at the airport, and wished her luck with her presentation. Then he drove home alone, parked in the driveway, and sat there for 10 minutes, staring at their house. He knew what he was about to do was wrong. A violation of trust, of privacy, of everything marriage was supposed to be. But he also knew he couldn't let it go. Not anymore. The suspicions had grown too large, too insistent. He needed to know. Even if knowing destroyed everything. Inside, the house felt different without Sarah. Emptier. He stood in the living room, looking around at their life together. The books on the shelves, the photographs on the walls, the furniture they'd chosen together. Everything looked normal. Everything looked right. He started in her study, the small second bedroom where she worked on her dissertation. Her desk was organized, stacks of books in Russian and English, note cards with quotations, drafts of chapters. He looked through the papers carefully, not disturbing the order. Academic work, nothing unusual. The desk had 3 drawers. The top 2 contained pens, paper clips, stamps, the usual office supplies. The bottom drawer was locked. Robert stared at the lock. Why would she lock a drawer in her own home, in a room he rarely entered? He could ask her about it when she returned. But he already knew what she'd say. Important documents, drafts she didn't want to lose, something perfectly innocent. He went to the garage and found his toolkit. The lock was cheap, standard. It took him 3 minutes to pick it open. Inside the drawer were several items, a second notebook, different from the one she carried around the house. A small camera, the kind used for photographing documents. 3 rolls of undeveloped film. And underneath everything, wrapped in a cloth, a small electronic device he recognized immediately from his training. It was a burst transmitter, used for sending encrypted messages in rapid transmissions that were difficult to intercept. Soviet intelligence used them to communicate with agents in the field. Robert sat back on his heels, his hands shaking. For a long moment he couldn't move, couldn't think. Then, moving on autopilot, he picked up the notebook and opened it. The handwriting was Sarah's, but the content wasn't poetry. It was information, dates, names, operational details. Notes about his work, his colleagues, his schedule. Code names he didn't recognize. References to meetings, dead drops, signal sites. And on the last page, written just 2 days ago, subject reports increased security measures at bowling. New vetting procedures for Soviet desk analysts. Recommend caution. Subject. She was calling him the subject. Robert felt sick. He closed the notebook and put everything back exactly as he'd found it, his hands still shaking. Then he locked the drawer, went downstairs, and sat on the couch in the dark. His wife was a Soviet agent, Sarah, the woman he'd married. The woman he'd trusted with everything. She'd been reporting on him, using him, lying to him from the beginning. Their entire relationship was a lie. Their marriage was an operation. He thought about the vetting process before they'd married. How thorough it had been. How she'd passed every check. Which meant she was a deep-cover illegal, probably inserted years before they'd met. The KGB had sent her to graduate school, created her legend, waited for her to get close to someone with access, and he'd been the target. He'd walked right into it. Robert sat there until dawn, trying to decide what to do. The correct procedure was clear. Report immediately to his superiors. Let the FBI handle it. Arrest her when she returned from New York. Typical case protocol. Sarah would be interrogated, probably offered a deal to flip, maybe imprisoned or exchanged for captured American agents, but she was still his wife. He still loved her, even now. Or he loved who he'd thought she was. Could any of it have been real? The way she looked at him? The way she laughed at his jokes? The way she'd cried when her father died? Had that all been training? Performance? He thought about that moment. Her father's funeral. Sarah sobbing in his arms, barely able to stand. He'd held her for hours. That couldn't have been fake. The grief had been real. Which meant her father's death had been real. Which meant at least that part of her background was true. Unless the KGB had killed her father. Unless even that had been part of the operation. Robert put his head in his hands. He couldn't think straight anymore. Every memory was contaminated now. Every moment they'd shared filtered through this new knowledge. He didn't know what was real and what wasn't. He didn't know if she'd ever loved him or if he'd been nothing but an assignment from the start. The sun came up. Robert showered, dressed, drove to work on automatic. He went through the motions of his job, reviewing files, attending meetings, but his mind was elsewhere. Several times, colleagues asked if he was feeling okay. He said he was fine, just tired. That evening, he called Colonel Bradley and requested an urgent meeting. They met in a secure conference room, just the two of them. "What is it, Hanley?" Robert took a breath. "Sir, I have reason to believe my wife is a Soviet intelligence officer." Bradley's expression didn't change. Explain. Robert told him everything. The notebooks, the phone calls in Russian, the locked drawer, the equipment he'd found. As he spoke, Bradley took notes, his face unreadable. When Robert finished, Bradley was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You're sure about what you saw? The transmitter? The film?" "Yes, sir. I've been trained to recognize that equipment. It was Soviet issue. And you didn't disturb anything? She won't know you found it? Everything is exactly as it was." Bradley nodded slowly. "All right. Here's what's going to happen. You're not going to tell anyone else about this. Not the FBI, not security, not your colleagues. I'll handle this through proper channels. You're going to go home tonight and act completely normal. When your wife returns from New York, you're going to treat her exactly as you always have. Can you do that?" "I don't know." "You have to, Hanley. If she suspects, she'll run. We'll lose her and any intelligence we might gain from surveillance. You need to keep her convinced that everything is normal. For how long? As long as it takes. We need to identify her contacts, her handlers, understand the scope of her network. That could take weeks, maybe months." Robert felt cold. "You want me to live with her? Pretend everything's fine? While she's spying on me? That's exactly what I want. You're a counterintelligence officer, Hanley. This is the job. I know it's personal, but right now, you're the best asset we have. You're already in place. She trusts you. She doesn't trust me. She's using me. Then use her back. Find out what she's after, what she's reporting, who she's reporting to. Be a professional." Robert stood up. "I need time to think about this. You don't have time. She comes back tomorrow. I need your answer now." In the silence that followed, Robert thought about Sarah's smile, her laugh, the way she'd looked at him on their wedding day. Every moment had been a calculation. Every touch had been part of the mission. She'd made him fall in love with her, and it had all been a lie. Or maybe it hadn't. Maybe somewhere in the pretending, something real had happened. Maybe she'd started to care for him, even love him, even as she betrayed him. Maybe that's what made her good at what she did. "I'll do it," Robert said finally. "I'll keep the surveillance going." Bradley nodded. "Good man. We'll install some monitoring equipment in your house while she's away. Phone taps, room audio. You won't know where they are. That's better for you. Just live your life normally and let us gather intelligence. What happens when you have enough? When you've identified her network? Then we make arrests. She'll be charged with espionage. Life in prison, most likely. Or we might offer her an exchange. Depends on what else we learn." Robert left the meeting feeling numb. He drove home, parked in the driveway, looked up at the house that was no longer a home. Somewhere inside, hidden in the walls or the ceiling or the furniture, technicians were installing surveillance equipment. His house was now a counterintelligence operation site. His marriage was now an intelligence case. He went inside and tried to sleep, but couldn't. He lay in bed, thinking about Sarah returning tomorrow. About having to look into her eyes and pretend he didn't know. About letting her touch him, kiss him, lie to him, while hidden microphones recorded every word. The next afternoon, he picked Sarah up at the airport. She looked tired but happy, talking excitedly about her presentation, how well it had been received. In the car, she reached over and squeezed his hand. "I missed you," she said. "Missed you too," he replied, and wondered if any part of that was true for either of them. The first week was the hardest. Robert had to relearn how to exist in his own home, knowing that everything was being recorded, knowing that every conversation with Sarah was simultaneously an interrogation and a performance. He was both investigator and subject, both hunter and bait. The awareness of the hidden microphones made him hyper-conscious of every word, every gesture, every moment of silence. Sarah seemed to notice nothing. She returned to her routine, working on her dissertation during the day, cooking dinner in the evening, asking about his work with that gentle, caring interest that now felt like razor blades against his skin. He answered carefully, giving her nothing classified but enough mundane detail to seem natural. He talked about office politics, frustrating meetings, bureaucratic paperwork, the kind of complaints any government employee might have. And he watched her, constantly, looking for signs of transmission, of contact with handlers, of anything that might reveal the scope of her operation. But Sarah was careful. If she was passing information, she was doing it in ways he couldn't detect. No suspicious phone calls, no unexplained absences, no meetings with strangers. She was either very good or very patient, probably both. At night, lying beside her in the darkness, Robert sometimes felt her watching him. Once he woke at 2 a.m. to find her awake, propped on one elbow, studying his face. When she saw his eyes open, she smiled and touched his cheek. "You were having a nightmare," she whispered. "You were talking in your sleep." His chest went tight. "What did I say?" "Nothing clear. Just muttering." "You seem distressed. Work stress." "Sorry if I woke you. You didn't." She lay back down, curling against him. "Robert, are you okay? You've seemed distant lately. Distracted." "I'm fine. Just a lot going on at the office. Anything you can talk about?" There it was, the gentle probe. The caring wife concerned about her husband's well-being, creating an opening for him to share information. He wondered if she'd learned this technique in training, or if it came naturally to her. He wondered if she knew how transparent it was to someone looking for it. "Nothing interesting," he said. "Just the usual bureaucratic nonsense." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, you can tell me anything, right? I'm your wife. Whatever's bothering you, we should talk about it." The irony was so sharp he almost laughed. Instead, he kissed her forehead. "I know. I love you. I love you too." He lay awake after she'd fallen back asleep, listening to her breathing, wondering if she'd just tried to extract information or if she'd been genuinely concerned. Wondering if there was even a difference anymore. Wondering if love and manipulation could exist in the same moment, if she could truly care for him while simultaneously betraying him. The surveillance teams working his case were professionals. Robert never saw them, never knew when they were listening or watching. Colonel Bradley had set up a system where Robert would report to a safe house once a week for debriefings. He would leave work early, citing a dentist appointment or personal errand, and meet with Bradley and an FBI counterintelligence specialist named Agent Carson. At the first debriefing, Carson showed him transcripts of conversations from his home. Seeing his own words typed out, clinical and cold, was disorienting. The mundane intimacy of marriage rendered as intelligence data, discussions about grocery shopping, what to watch on television, whether they should get a cat. And woven through it all, Sarah's careful questions about his work, his schedule, his colleagues. "She's good," Carson said, scanning the transcripts. "Very subtle. Never pushes too hard." Most of her questions seemed completely natural in context. But look at the pattern. He spread out several days' worth of transcripts. "She's systematically gathering information about your office layout, security procedures, the timing of classified briefings, who has access to what." Over time, it builds a comprehensive picture. "Has she made contact with anyone?" Robert asked. "Not yet. At least not in any way we've detected. But she will. She has to pass this intelligence somehow. When she does, we'll identify her handlers and potentially roll up the entire network." "How long do I have to do this?" Bradley answered. "As long as it takes. I know this is difficult, Hanley, but you're doing important work. Every day you maintain this cover, we learn more about Soviet intelligence operations in the capital. Your sacrifice matters." Sacrifice. That's what they were calling it. His marriage, his trust, his sanity. A sacrifice for national security. Robert understood the logic. He believed in the mission, but understanding didn't make it easier. He went home that evening and kissed his wife hello and felt like he was kissing a ghost. A beautiful, familiar ghost who whispered lies in the darkness. May turned to June. The weather warmed. Sarah worked on her dissertation, spending long hours in her study. Several times, Robert noticed she'd locked the bottom drawer again after he'd found the equipment. He never went back to look. The surveillance teams would handle that. They'd photographed everything during their initial installation. They knew what she had. One Saturday morning, Sarah suggested they take a drive into the countryside. It was a beautiful day, she said. They could pack a picnic, get away from the city for a few hours. Robert agreed, partly because refusing would seem suspicious, partly because he was curious what she was planning. They drove west into Virginia horse country, the landscape rolling in green. Sarah had packed sandwiches, fruit, a bottle of wine. They found a spot near a small lake and spread a blanket under an oak tree. For an hour, they ate and talked about nothing important, memories of college, funny stories about professors, plans for a vacation they might take in the fall. It felt almost normal, almost like the relationship Robert had thought they had. Then Sarah said, "Robert, I need to tell you something." His heart rate spiked. This was it. She was going to confess. Or run. Or recruit him. He kept his face neutral. "What is it?" She looked down at her hands, picking at a thread on the blanket. "I've been thinking about stopping my doctoral program," not what he'd expected. "Why?" "I don't know if academia is really what I want anymore. The politics, the pettiness, the endless writing about things that don't matter to anyone outside a very small circle. I've been questioning whether it's worth the effort. You love Russian poetry. I do. But maybe I don't need a PhD to love it. Maybe I could do something else. Get a real job. We could save money. Maybe buy a house with a yard." "Start thinking about children." Robert studied her face. She seemed sincere, vulnerable. Was this her legend breaking down? Was the pressure of the double life getting to her? Or was this another manipulation, an attempt to seem more committed to their life together, to deflect any suspicion? "Don't make any decisions hastily," he said carefully. "You've worked hard on this degree. You're close to finishing. Maybe that's the problem." "I'm close to finishing, and I'm realizing I don't want what comes after. Teaching at a university, writing articles no one reads, attending conferences where everyone pretends their work matters. I want something real, Robert. I want us to build a real life." She looked up at him, and there were tears in her eyes. Real tears. He could see them catching the sunlight. Either she was the best actress he'd ever seen, or something genuine was happening here. Some crack in her cover, some moment of actual honesty breaking through the lies. He pulled her close and she cried against his chest. He held her and stroked her hair and whispered that everything would be okay. While in his mind he wondered if this moment was being recorded. If surveillance teams in a van somewhere were analyzing this conversation, trying to determine if it was real or performance. After she'd calmed down, they packed up the picnic and drove home in silence. That evening, Sarah was quiet, withdrawn. She went to bed early. Robert stayed up, staring at nothing, trying to process what had happened. The next morning, at his weekly debriefing, he asked Carson and Bradley what they thought. "Could be genuine emotional stress," Carson said. "Double agents often experience psychological strain. Living two lives takes a toll." "Or it could be a new approach," Bradley added. "Make herself seem more invested in the marriage, more committed to a domestic life. Make you trust her more, lower your guard. We can't know for certain. How do I respond? Same as always. Be supportive but non-committal. Don't encourage her to quit the program, but don't discourage it either. Let her make the decision. Whatever she chooses will tell us something." In the end, Sarah didn't quit. By the following week, she seemed to have moved past whatever crisis she'd experienced. She returned to her work with renewed focus, spending even longer hours in her study. But something had changed between them. A new distance had opened up, subtle but present. They still went through the motions of marriage, but the warmth had gone out of it. They were two actors who'd performed the same play so many times they'd stopped feeling the words. July brought a heat wave. The house, without air conditioning, became stifling. Robert slept poorly, waking sweaty and disoriented in the middle of the night. One such night, around 3 a.m., he woke to find Sarah's side of the bed empty. He lay still, listening. No sound from the bathroom, no light under the door. He got up quietly and checked the house. She wasn't in the kitchen or living room. Her study door was closed, but light showed in the crack beneath it. Robert stood in the hallway listening. He could hear the soft sound of her voice, speaking Russian in a low, urgent tone. A phone conversation. At 3 a.m., he couldn't make out the words clearly through the door, but the tone was unmistakable. She was reporting. This was it. After months of waiting, she was making contact with her handlers. Robert stood frozen, barely breathing, straining to hear. The conversation lasted perhaps 3 minutes. Then, silence. The light went off. A moment later, the door opened. Sarah gasped when she saw him standing there. "God, you scared me. What are you doing up? Couldn't sleep." "Too hot." "Who were you talking to?" "My aunt in Pennsylvania. She called earlier, but I missed it. I didn't want to wake you, so I took it in my study." "At 3 a.m.? She's elderly. Gets confused about time sometimes. Thinks it's earlier than it is." The lie was smooth, delivered without hesitation. Robert nodded. "Everything okay with her?" "Fine. Just lonely. You know how she is. Come back to bed." They lay in the heat, not touching. Robert waited until Sarah's breathing deepened into sleep, then got up again. In the kitchen, he wrote a brief note on a slip of paper. Subject made contact at 0300 hours. Phone call in Russian from her study. Claims it was her aunt. He tucked the note in his shoe, where he'd leave it for the surveillance team to find and photograph during one of their periodic equipment checks. At his next debriefing, Carson confirmed they'd recorded the call. It hadn't been to Pennsylvania. It had been to a phone number registered to a Soviet trade mission office in New York. The call had lasted 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Most of it was coded communication they were still working to decrypt, but they'd identified enough to confirm Sarah was definitely an active agent and the New York number was definitely a KGB front. "We're getting close," Carson said. "She's getting ready to pass something significant. We need you to be extra careful now. If she's preparing for a major intelligence transfer, she might be more alert to counter-surveillance. Don't do anything that might spook her." But Robert's control was fraying. Months of living the lie were taking their toll. He found himself making small mistakes, forgetting conversations they'd supposedly had, mixing up dates, showing irritation at questions that should have seemed innocent. Sarah noticed. She had to have noticed. She was too good not to. One evening in late July, she confronted him directly. They were in the kitchen after dinner. Robert was washing dishes. Sarah came up behind him and put her hand on his shoulder. "Robert, I need you to be honest with me. Are you having an affair?" He turned, genuinely shocked. "What? No. Why would you think that?" "Because you've been distant for months. You barely look at me. When we talk, you seem to be somewhere else. You come to bed late. You leave early. Either you're seeing someone else or you don't want to be married to me anymore. Which is it?" The accusations hung in the air. In a strange way, they were almost funny. She was accusing him of betrayal while simultaneously betraying him far more profoundly. But he couldn't laugh. He couldn't tell her the truth. He could only maintain the lie. "I'm not having an affair. I love you. Work has been intense, that's all. I'm sorry if I've been distracted." "Intense how?" "You never tell me anything anymore. Because most of it's classified, you know that. I'm your wife. I have clearance. We used to talk about your work. Things have changed. The nature of what I'm doing has changed. I can't discuss it. I'm sorry." She stared at him, her eyes searching his face for something she couldn't find. Then she nodded slowly. "Okay. If that's how it has to be." She walked away, leaving him standing at the sink with soapy hands, wondering how much longer he could maintain this charade before something inside him broke completely. The break came in August. Robert was at work, reviewing surveillance photos from a different case, when Bradley called him into his office. Carson was there, looking grim. "We've got a problem," Bradley said without preamble. "Sarah made a dead drop yesterday afternoon. We followed her to a park in Georgetown. She left a package under a bench near the boat dock. Classic tradecraft. We photographed the drop, but we didn't retrieve the package. We wanted to see who picked it up, and..." Robert's mouth was dry. "No one did. After 2 hours, she came back and retrieved it herself. which means either she spotted our surveillance or her handler didn't show. Either way, it suggests she might be suspicious. We need to consider pulling you out. What does that mean? It means we arrest her, soon. Maybe this week, before she can run. Robert felt like the floor had dropped away. This was what he'd been working toward for months. The resolution, the end of the lie. But now that it was here, he found himself desperately wanting more time. Not to protect Sarah, to protect himself, to prepare for what came next. The collapse of his marriage. The knowledge that everyone would know he'd been played, that he'd been sleeping with an enemy agent, that his judgment had been compromised in the most fundamental way possible. "Give me a few more days," he heard himself saying. She might just have been spooked by something random. A police car, a suspicious person. Let me see if I can figure out what she's thinking. Bradley and Carson exchanged glances. 48 hours, Bradley said finally. Then we move. This has already gone on longer than it should have. The risk is getting too high. Robert went home that evening with a sense of impending doom. Sarah was in the kitchen, cooking. The smell of garlic and herbs filled the house. She was making pasta, one of her specialties. She smiled when she saw him, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "How was your day?" she asked. "Fine. Yours?" "Quiet. I went for a walk in Georgetown. Needed to clear my head, so she was going to admit to being there." Interesting. Was it innocence or a cover story? They ate dinner, making small talk. The pasta was delicious. Sarah had always been a good cook. Robert found himself wondering if she'd learned that from her mother, or if it had been part of her training. If Soviet intelligence schools taught their illegals how to make authentic Italian food alongside cryptography and surveillance techniques. After dinner, Sarah poured 2 glasses of wine and led him to the couch. She sat close to him, something she hadn't done in weeks. She took his hand. "Robert, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without interrupting." His pulse hammered. This was it. She was going to confess, or run, or recruit him. He nodded, not trusting his voice. "I know you've been unhappy," she began. "I know something's wrong between us. I've tried to give you space, tried to be patient, but it's eating me alive. I love you. I love you more than I can express. And I can't stand this distance anymore." She took a breath, tears forming in her eyes. "I want us to leave. Not just this house, Washington, the whole intelligence world. I want us to go somewhere quiet, somewhere we can be normal people with normal lives. Maybe California, maybe abroad. Somewhere we can start over. Without the weight of secrets and classified briefings and the constant pressure of this city." Robert stared at her. Was this a recruitment pitch? An extraction plan? Or was she genuinely suggesting they run away together? "I have my work," he managed. "My career. Do you love it? Really? Because from where I'm sitting, it's destroying you, it's destroying us. What's the point of serving your country if you lose everything that makes life worth living?" She was crying now, actual tears streaming down her face. "I want my husband back, Robert. I want the man I married. The man who used to laugh and dream and believe we could build something beautiful together. That man is disappearing, and I don't know how to save him, how to save us." In that moment, Robert believed her. Not because he was naive or foolish, but because the pain in her voice was too raw to be performance. She was telling him something true, even if it wasn't the whole truth. She was telling him she was tired, tired of lying, tired of the life she'd been living. Whether that life was being married to a counterintelligence officer or being a Soviet agent or both, he couldn't tell. Maybe she couldn't tell either anymore. "I can't just leave," he said quietly. "It doesn't work that way." "Then what are we doing, Robert? What's the point of any of this if we're just going to keep hurting each other?" He had no answer. They sat in silence, her head on his shoulder, tears soaking through his shirt. Outside, night fell over Arlington. Somewhere, surveillance teams were recording this conversation, analyzing every word, looking for operational significance. But in that moment, Robert didn't care. He held his wife and let her cry, and wondered if 2 people could truly love each other while simultaneously destroying each other. If there was any difference between love and tragedy when you stripped away all the lies. The next morning, Sarah was gone when he woke. No note. No explanation. Her car was in the driveway. Her purse was on the kitchen counter, but she'd taken her passport and the contents of the locked drawer in her study. Robert called Bradley immediately. Within an hour, every law enforcement and intelligence agency in the Washington area was looking for Sarah Hanley. They checked airports, train stations, bus terminals. They monitored known Soviet safe houses and diplomatic facilities. But she had vanished. She'd been trained for this. Trained to disappear. To shed one identity and assume another. To cross borders and evade detection. The KGB hadn't sent her to America unprepared. They'd given her resources, networks, contingency plans, everything she needed to run. 3 days later, they found her car abandoned at a shopping mall in Baltimore. Security footage showed her entering the mall at 9 a.m. the morning she'd left, then exiting an hour later wearing different clothes with different hair. After that, the trail went cold. Robert was removed from active duty pending a full security review. Standard procedure when an intelligence officer's spouse was compromised. They'd investigate whether he'd known, whether he'd been complicit, whether he'd been turned. The fact that he'd reported her wouldn't fully protect him. The questions would go on for months. His career was probably over. He sat in his empty house, surrounded by the life they'd built, and tried to understand what had happened. Had any of it been real? Her love, her tears, her suggestion that they run away together? Or had it all been manipulation, one final attempt to recruit him or extract herself when she realized she'd been compromised? He'd never know. That was perhaps the cruelest part. He'd spend the rest of his life wondering which moments had been genuine and which had been lies. Wondering if she'd ever loved him, or if he'd been nothing but a target from the start. Wondering if she was still alive or if the KGB had already disposed of an asset who'd become a liability. 2 weeks after Sarah disappeared, a letter arrived at the house. No return address. Postmarked from Toronto. Inside, in Sarah's handwriting, "I'm sorry. For everything. You deserved better than what I gave you. Some of it was real. I hope you can believe that. Even if you can't, it's the truth." Robert burned the letter in the kitchen sink and watched the paper curl and blacken. Then he packed a bag and drove to his brother's house in Ohio, where no one knew anything about the Cold War or intelligence operations or the price of secrets. He stayed there for a month, sleeping late, drinking too much, trying to forget. When he finally returned to Washington, the security review concluded he'd acted properly and without knowledge of his wife's activities. His career could continue if he wanted it, but Robert declined. He resigned from DIA, left the intelligence community, and took a job teaching history at a small college in upstate New York. He never married again, never really tried. Some wounds don't heal. They just become part of who you are. Years later, after the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, some KGB files were made public. Robert never looked for Sarah's real name in those files. He didn't want to know, didn't want to turn her into a case study, a footnote in intelligence history. Better to remember her as she'd been in those moments he still believed might have been real, reading poetry in the morning light, laughing at his terrible jokes, crying on his shoulder in the darkness. Because whether she'd loved him or not, whether any of it had been genuine, or all of it had been lies, one thing was certain: they'd destroyed each other. And in the silent war of espionage and betrayal, that meant both sides had lost. The only victory belonged to silence itself, which keeps all secrets forever, and judges none.